Good evening, everyone. As Jeff said, my name is Meg Stack, and tonight I will be talking with you about the origins of modern place names in and around Tampa Bay. Toponymy. What on earth is toponymy? Well, toponymy is what I have actually been doing for the last few months as I've been researching the origins of place names. You probably don't know how different landforms or bodies of water in the Tampa Bay area actually ended up with their names. This presentation is a look into the story behind a few of these places and their relationship with a particular time period and type of settlement in Florida, the period of the Cuban fishing ranchos. They include Maximo Point and Bunce's Pass in Pinellas County, Miguel Bay and Perico Island in Manatee County, and Philippi Creek in Sarasota. So toponymy asks the question, what is in a name? And more specifically, toponymy asks the question, what is in a place name? A more correct definition, though, is the study of the names of settlements and other geographical features. Toponymy helps researchers by determining things like the date of the settlement, the location of geographical features from the past that no longer exist, and most importantly for our purposes in this project, the origins or ethnic identity of the people who lived or worked on that land. Places are sometimes named after a particular feature of the land, either natural or man-made. Examples of this are Crystal River or Fort Myers. Places can also take on a name as a result of a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, or a poor pronunciation. A local example of this is Miguel Bay. In this particular case, the place name has often been anglicized from its original spelling or pronunciation. Some of you may have heard of McDill or McGill Bay, located along the southern shore of Terracea. Old maps even have an incorrect place name inscribed on them. However, this was merely the mispronunciation or anglicized version of Miguel Bay, named after Miguel Guerrero, an early homesteader in Manatee County and fisherman of Spanish and Minorcan descent. Places can even be given a mistaken name. An example of this is Nome, Alaska, which was originally called No Name, but was copied down wrong and ended up with its current spelling. Within this presentation, however, the places we will be looking at were named after specific but somewhat little-known historic figures. These men were fishermen, or descendants of fishermen, who participated in the 18th and 19th century maritime trade with Cuba. Many of these fishermen and their families worked at or set up their own fishing enterprises, known as fishing ranchos, along the Florida Gulf Coast from Charlotte Harbor to Tampa Bay. So who exactly were these fishermen? What was their story? How did their names end up affixed to the lands that they operated from? To answer these questions, we need to start south of Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor, at a little key near Usepa Island. It is there that the historic records first make mention of a name people in Manatee County are likely to be familiar with. That name is Perico, Perico Pompon to be exact. Beginning in 1790, the Spanish government offered free grants of land to anyone willing to settle areas of Florida, which at the time was vastly unpopulated and a very harsh environment. After the U.S. claimed Florida as a territory in 1821, these land grants were reevaluated for accuracy, and those that were found to be valid were honored. In 1828, Mr. Pompon lived on a small key called Key Palau, now known as Calle Palau, with his wife and 3 children. He was 40 years old at the time, and he was a fisherman by trade. He had evidently been fishing those waters since 1815. At the time, many fishermen based their fishing ranchos in Charlotte Harbor. A well-documented rancho located in the vicinity of Calle Palau was the base for the operation of Joseph Caldiz. Perico Pompon either fished for Caldiz, sharing in the profit, or it's possible that he operated his own rancho alongside Caldiz. Either way, historical records show that the 2 fishermen were on really good terms. Caldiz vouched for Perico on his claim for land under the Spanish land grants. While unconfirmed and possibly invalid, this documentation indicates that at least for a short time, Perico Pompon laid claim to ownership rights of that island, the Little Calle Palau. The next mention of Perico in the historical records is 1841, and these accounts place him much further north, near the mouth of the Manatee River. At this time, he was working with 2 other Spanish fishermen by the names of Felipe Bermudez and Manuel Olivella. Also, according to many sources, Perico was one of the men who helped Josiah Gates make his way to the land that he would eventually homestead, and that later became the village of Manatee near present-day downtown Bradenton. Perico and his 2 friends evidently lived on a nearby island where they worked and lived. They would often visit Gates and his family, bringing roe, mullet, and sea grapes as gifts. It's very possible that this was the island that would eventually be given the name Perico Island. Now, why he ended up so far from his original location isn't known, but one theory is that due to many of the Indian raids on the Ranchos during the Second Seminole War, he and his family were forced to flee, along with many of the other fishermen and their families from Charlotte Harbor. Many of these people sought refuge at the rancho of Mr. William Bunce, who offered them what shelter and safety he could during the war. William Bunce was not Spanish, and he was not a fisherman either. By trade, he was a sea captain in the mercantile business and an entrepreneur. Originally from Maryland, Bunce witnessed firsthand the success of trade with Cuba while he was in Key West throughout the 1820s, and he decided to finance a fishing rancho to be located in the area of Tampa Bay. At the time, Hillsborough County actually encompassed all of Sarasota, Manatee, and Pinellas counties, and in 1834, Florida Governor Duval named Bunce the Justice of the Peace for all of Hillsborough County. Not long after, Bunce found an area at the mouth of the Manatee River, a location where there had already been a rancho, and he built his own fishing operation there. He likely employed many of the same workers from the previous rancho, some of whom had been born and raised along the Manatee River and southern shores of Tampa Bay. A few even had grandchildren there. At first, he operated the rancho seasonally and used the Enterprise, a 45-ton sloop owned by his friend and associate, Fielding Brown, to transport the fishermen's catch. Beginning in the winter of 1836 and 1837, Spanish fishermen and Spanish Indians of the ranchos often acted as guides for the American forces who were involved in the outset of the Second Seminole War. The fishing operations were often the targets of the Seminole attacks for this very reason. However, due to the Indian heritage of many of the rancho workers and their families, they were also targeted by the U.S. government. Afraid of losing his workforce, Bunce later spoke out against their removal under the Indian Removal Act. Due to increased attacks on the fisheries by the Seminoles, Bunce apparently moved his rancho to a location northeast of Passage Key, nearer to the safety of the large American ships. The location of this was probably where Mullet Key is today, but it's referred to in the historical record as Palm Island. Soon thereafter, in September of 1936, he had the rancho moved from along the shorelines to the sparse interior of the barrier island for further safety. Due to the evacuation of Caldiz's rancho in Charlotte Harbor, which also happened in 1836, Bunce's rancho swelled to 163 people. In 1837, around 700 Seminoles escaped from Fort Brooke in Tampa the night before their removal. Suspected of involvement, Bunce's rancho was raided, and over 100 people were taken captive, interrogated, but eventually let go. In the spring of 1838, Colonel Jessup ordered soldiers to the rancho while the men were gone. The soldiers seized all women and children of Indian blood and transported them to New Orleans to join a party of emigrating Seminoles. After learning of the deportation, some husbands followed their families to the northern Gulf Coast. Others petitioned the government to be allowed to remain in Florida. Later in 1838, Bunce was elected Hillsborough County's delegate to the Constitutional Convention. On January 11, 1839, he signed Florida's first constitution. Sometime between then and October of 1840, William Bunce died. In that same year, Captain Plummer landed ashore at Palm Island from the steamer Thomas Salmond under Master Michael Frederick. By order of the new commander, General Armistead, Bunce's rancho was burnt to the ground. His legacy survives, however, as the pass shown here is named in honor of Bunce and the rancho he owned and operated in the vicinity. Today, a small section of city-owned land in South St. Petersburg continues the legacy of another fisherman of Spanish-Cuban descent. The name Maximo Point refers to the point of land where a city park, aptly named Maximo Park, is situated. This name is shortened from the full name of the first owner of the land, Antonio Maximo Hernandez. Maximo is known to have been working at Bunce's original rancho at the mouth of the Manatee River before the war, and then at the Palm Island Rancho afterward. He also spent time during the Second Seminole War working at Fort Armistead, where documents show that he earned $1 a day. According to one source, Maximo took Robert E. Lee up the Caloosahatchee River in search of the Seminoles during the war. Supposedly, this is what led to a commendation of Maximo from the War Department. The acclamation may have also resulted in award of a land grant under the Armed Occupation Act of 1842. The act created a policy for settlers to acquire 160 acres of land as long as they were 18 years or older, could clear up to 5 acres, and carry arms. In addition, the land could not be within 2 miles of a military post that was considered permanent, the grantee could not own another 160 acres, and coastal islands were not included. In his land grant documentation, Maximo claims that he was a Florida resident since 1814. Much of this time was most likely spent fishing at one of the coastal ranchos. Between the time Maximo received the land and the devastating hurricane of 1848, he operated his own fishing rancho from there. Maximo Point is located to the west of Pinellas Point, or Punta Pinal as it was known then. Maximo was St. Pete's first homesteader, and he also supposedly worked as Colonel Brooks' guide on hunting and fishing trips through the Keys. Unfortunately, the hurricane of 1848 completely destroyed the homestead on Maximo Point. Some sources say that he then returned to Havana, but his story doesn't end there. On his documentation for the land grant, Maximo claims that he's a widower. However, there were suspicious claims to his land after he returned to Cuba. An alleged wife of his, Dominga, had the land transferred to her after his supposed death in 1852, which was 4 years after any mention of him in the historical record. Dominga remarried a Frenchman, but she never paid taxes, and she didn't record the deed to the land until 1887. It was also somehow sold twice to 2 different people who evidently never occupied the property. Instead, it was eventually sold for unpaid taxes and ended up in the hands of the city of St. Petersburg. Another Spanish fisherman who probably worked with Maximo at Bunce's Rancho, and who certainly knew Perico Pompon, was Felipe Bermudez. Unlike Perico, who moved from a rancho in the south to give his name to an island further north, Felipe worked at Bunce's Rancho, and then gave his name to Philippi Creek, which is south of Tampa Bay in present-day Sarasota. During the Second Seminole War, Bermudez had also been at William Bunce's Rancho on Palm Island. Philippi apparently had 2 Indian wives who were, along with his 2 sons and 3 daughters, taken from that rancho and deported in 1838. The next mention of Philippi in the historical record is in 1841, when Josiah Gates and his family met the trio of fishermen that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Evidently, Philippi spoke good English as well as Seminole, and according to the History of Manatee County by Joseph Simpson, he was the kind-hearted owner of the principal rancho near the Gates' settlement. Josiah's son, Edward Franklin Gates, called him Uncle Philippi. Philippi also supposedly took care of the ailing 6-year-old when they first moved to the area. But Philippi drops out of the historical record until an 1847 survey done by A.H. Jones, which revealed 1 neighbor south of present-day Whitaker's Bayou in Sarasota. The notation, Philippi's house and clearing, is apparently the rancho of Philippi Bermudez, located in the vicinity of present-day Cherokee Park. As far as I could determine, there's no record of the land ever being granted to Philippi, so it's very possible that he was essentially a squatter. The first record of Philippi Creek being called that was in 1878 in Charles Abbey's postal location site record on June 18th of that year. The last of the fishermen that I researched is Miguel Guerrero, who was one of the few remaining Spanish fishermen to occupy land in the Tampa Bay area in the mid to late 1800s. Even when he began his rancho, the era of the large prosperous fishing ranchos was coming to an end. Miguel was born in 1810 on the Balearic island of Minorca in Spain. He arrived in Tampa Bay in 1848 and was aided by the trio of Manuel Olivella, Perico, and Philippi. On March 15, 1856, he married Frederica Kramer, who was the Bavarian niece of the Atzeroths, and they were the first permanent settlers on Terracea Island. Miguel and Frederica first settled the land adjacent to Miguel Bay and a piece of land known today as Boots Point. It's very likely that their original living quarters was a palm-thatched hut, but Miguel later added a log cabin after the birth of their first child, Michael, in 1857. In total, Miguel and Frederica had 5 children, 4 boys and a girl. Miguel managed his rancho as a small fishing camp that relied on Cuban smacks to market his catch. These sloops ran between 31 and 39 tons and were outfitted with saltwater holds or tanks to keep the fish alive rather than curing them. The boats would make commercial trips to Havana every 10 days to 2 weeks, as opposed to the earlier, larger fishing rancho operations, which would have cured the fish and then made the trip to Havana only every few months. In addition to working as a fisherman, Miguel enlisted in military service for the Second and Third Seminole Wars. He also served at the beginning of the Civil War, but was forced to stop due to health problems. He suffered from chronic rheumatism, and after a hospitalization in Knoxville in 1863, the armed services discharged him due to disability. He then served the war efforts back at home with Frederica by providing farm products and fish. In 1868, Miguel homesteaded his land, the area known today as Miguel Bay. Unfortunately, tragedy struck the Guerrero family 4 months later. A yellow fever epidemic hit the area and claimed the lives of his wife and his sons, Michael and Frederick. Not long after, Miguel himself succumbed to the disease. The remaining Guerrero children, Christopher and Mary, were adopted by Reverend Lee from Manatee, while Robert was taken in by John and Mary Fogarty of Fogartyville near Bradenton. Robert took their last name and was later deeded his deceased father's land. Over the years, and even well into the latter half of the 1900s, the body of water that had been given Miguel's name was oftentimes misspelled and mispronounced as McDill or McGill. The wrong place name even appeared on nautical charts and travel maps all the way through the 1900s. This has now been changed to the correct spelling and pronunciation on most maps, and hopefully in the lexicon of those that know of the small bay. So the next time you navigate through Bunce's Pass, go fishing at Philippi Creek, or picnic at Maximo Park, remember the Spanish fishermen who once lived, worked, and raised their families on these lands. And don't forget that the thriving fishing market of Florida had its origins in the pioneering efforts of the men and women of the 18th and 19th centuries who worked on the Spanish fishing ranchos along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Jeff Moates, in case y'all forgot. Thanks, Meg. That was great. What it really kind of highlighted was this later period of the Cuban fishing ranchos. And so what I'm going to try to do with this presentation is talk about the origins of and kind of the general history or general operational history of these ranchos and what they were involved in. So Florida's Gulf Coast fishing ranchos and the Cuban Trade. There's the artwork again. It's all over the place. And with this program, what we tried to do was really talk about these ranchos and explain a little bit of their past and their and kind of what they are. And so we formed these couple of objectives, which we really tried to present in everything that this program is. So the traveling museum exhibit, these presentations, the events, the day events that are associated with it. And so we really tried to hit on these three objectives. What is a Cuban fishing rancho? Why Florida's Gulf Coast? And who lived there and what did the ranchos look like? So really just kind of simple objectives, and hopefully you'll get a better glimpse or a better idea of what these ranchos are or were after these presentations. So I'll try to get through all three of these objectives. First, to establish a presence in Havana. In 1537, the Spanish Empire, the Spanish government, set up an official convoy system to transport New World goods back and forth from New Spain to Old Spain across the Atlantic, really to thwart any kind of pirate activity that was hampering efforts of getting all this New World extracted material back to Spain and back to the coffers there. And what the convoy did is basically they would leave Spain, enter into the Caribbean, and then split. The south, the Tierra Firme, would head over to Cartagena, sometimes picking up gold and silver from Lima and those areas in South America. And the other fleet would go to Veracruz and overland would pick up materials from the Manila galleons from Acapulco that would land at Acapulco. And then once they were all loaded up, basically they would reconvene or rendezvous in Havana and set off from there. And from Havana, which quickly became an important port, Spanish port in the New World because of this convoy system, and really was really the spot that everybody went to before they went back home. They'd leave from Havana, and this is where most of the treasure fleets, if you are familiar with the treasure fleet disasters, they would leave from Havana, head up the Gulf Stream, and then back over across the Atlantic, riding those Gulf Stream waters. So in 1628 and 1715 and 1733, there were some famous Spanish fleet disasters that ended up along the Florida coastlines, but from Havana they would leave. So Havana quickly established as a very important place, which really created a haven, a colonial outpost, a colonial empire there in the New World. And the city of Havana, Havana Harbor, and this other town called Regla, and that's what we're really going to focus on, is this associated town, Regla, where most of the Cuban fishing families, the Cuban fishermen, hailed from. I don't know if it was the working part of Havana Harbor, but it might as well be, at least for these purposes. So here's Havana Harbor. And so what is a Cuban fishing rancho? And we're really going to try to explain or go into the first part of this, the operational history or kind of the operation of these ranchos. So during the late 18th century, the South Florida fishing fleet was generally comprised of perhaps 10 to 12 shallow drafted sailing vessels based in the fishing community of Regla, just across the harbor from downtown Havana. During the late fall and winter months, generally extending from October to November through February or March, the fishermen would sail north to the Florida coastline, focusing in particular on what was called the Coast of Tampa, including the Port of Sanibel and the Port of Tampa, and to a certain extent also including the Florida Keys and the lower Atlantic coastline of South Florida. There they would spend 4 or 5 months net fishing in the rich estuaries of Charlotte Harbor, Tampa Bay, and other places, salting their catch of probably mostly mullet and other fish. If anybody's familiar with the Mullet Run on the west central coast, it really starts in those late fall, early winter months and then runs through up until about February or March. So toward the beginning of the Lenten season, which independent records indicate was the season of peak demand for fish in Havana, the vessels would return to sell their catch. In the off-season, these same vessels were employed in transporting salt from the rich production facilities in Cayos Sal in the modern-day Bahamas, which is modern-day Bahamas, and the Punta de Jicacos on the northern coast of Cuba. Records indicate that vessels would make multiple trips loaded with salt, typically extending between May and August or September, and ending just before the peak of the hurricane season, when the vessels would presumably be sheltered and idle. So that's pretty much the Rancho, kind of the operation. So during the late 18th century, Cuba's South Florida fishing fleet seems to have been strictly seasonal. At some point by the turn of the century, however, these seasonal interactions evolved into something more, eventually crystallizing into a number of year-round fishing communities called ranchos, located on coastal islands and mainland shores between Estero Bay and Tampa Bay. By the first decades of the 19th century, much of the Cuban fishing community actually resided in these Florida ranchos, voyaging only to Cuba to sell their catch or to bring family members for church sacraments. And when Florida was transferred to U.S. jurisdiction, most remained in their Florida ranchos as expatriates, as we learned in Meg's talk. One example is Peruco Pompon, correct? Some even applying unsuccessfully for land grants like he did based on prior occupation. So, why Florida's Gulf Coast? It seemed that there was an abundance of untapped resources, and really proximity to Cuba are good reasons why. There's also an opportunity of this that was presented by an era of colonial expansion and the kind of flip-flopping or the swapping of new territories in Florida and South Florida. So these also had a big effect on the development of the Cuban fishing ranchos in Florida. And this question also kind of leads into the who. The answer begins to answer the other question, the who were at these places. And also another aspect might be these overextended nature of these colonial enterprises or these colonial powers, leaving kind of a vacuum in South Florida open for enterprising individuals to take advantage of the resources that were there. So, of course, they came up and were really seeking this guy right here, mullet. Here's a pompano, red drum, and mackerel, and those are the fish types that really were heavily sought after, and they run in schools. They're easier to catch in nets, and were probably the most prevalent fish types that were fish species that were thus traded down in Havana. So let's look a little further back. When these Spanish fishing vessels or these enterprising individuals really started taking advantage of the Florida coastlines. Spanish fishing vessels operating out of the vicinity of Havana had apparently been fishing in Florida waters with permission from the indigenous Calusa by no later than the 1680s, continuing and expanding after the evacuation of the Calusa homeland to the Florida Keys between 1704 and 1711 in response to Yamasee and Creek Indian slave raids. By the 1740s, am I right there? By the 1740s, Cuban-based fishing vessels routinely employed guides and fishermen from what few indigenous South Florida groups were living on or near the Florida Keys. But continued aggression from Creek raiders ultimately pushed these remaining Keys Indians south to Key West itself. From there, in May of 1760, less than 70 survivors finally fled permanently to Cuba, leaving the entire Florida peninsula to the English allied Creeks, who had even been attacking Cuban fishing vessels during the course of the 7 Years' War beginning in 1756. So kind of a lot of stuff going Despite the 1763 surrender of Florida to British control, the Cuban fishing industry continued largely unabated throughout the next 2 decades of Florida's British period. Florida's peninsular Gulf Coast had always remained largely outside the effective reach of Spanish colonial authorities, and this didn't change under British rule, making it easy for Cuban fishermen to continue their seasonal fishing voyages unhindered by the change in colonial administration. So this is where most records talk about the Cuban fishing ranchos really becoming more permanent settlements in South Florida. Before they were pretty much seasonal. And now by this time, the 1780s, is when we really know through historical documents, although there might be some give or take there, that these became permanent settlements when these Cuban fishing families really resided in southern Florida more often than not. So, who lived there? We know about the Spaniards, but there's a question. The question remains the identities of the Spanish Indians that they became known as, that worked alongside the Spanish fishermen and the exact nature of their relationship. A number of scholars have delved into the matter, some stating that they were simply Seminoles associated with the Cuban fishing industry, others speculating that they were actually surviving remnants of the indigenous Calusa Indians who had interacted with Spaniards for centuries by that time. However, in contrast, and this was mentioned in Meg's presentation as well, an 1838 petition by the remaining Spanish fishermen and sailors themselves instead claimed that their Indian and part Indian wives and children had been unjustly removed west with the Seminoles in 1837, when in fact they were an entirely separate group that had been intermarried with the Spanish for decades and should not be considered part of the Seminole nation at all. Confirming the claims of the Spanish fishermen themselves, the Spanish Indians of southwest Florida were neither Seminole or Calusa, but instead represent an example of an emergent Creole community that developed during the late 18th and initial 19th centuries, probably between Creek and Yamasee Indians and the Spanish fishermen that were originally based in Regla, Cuba, who developed a symbiotic or what became a familial relationship along the southern coast of peninsular Florida. And these Indians that were coming into Florida probably preceded the Seminole presence in southern Florida by many decades. So, this is a good point in the presentation to really give credit to where most of this information is coming from. Dr. John Worth, we tried to get him down here to speak as part of this program and these events, and it just never worked. It never figured in timing-wise. So we got the next best thing, which is his research and his presentation. He allowed us and gave us permission to pretty much use. And this is something that he wrote, he put forth just recently for a Society of Historical Archaeology conference that took place in Amelia Island, northeast Florida in January. So he spent a number of years and continues today researching Cuban fishing ranchos and their impact to the development of South Florida. He's got a lot of raw data. He's been to archives in Seville and even in Cuba, was granted permission. And so he's extracted a lot of really neat information, baptismal records, port records, all kinds of stuff. And so eventually there's going to be this great book, I think, by Dr. Worth about Cuban fishing ranchos. And the work that he's done up till now really asks the question, who were these Spanish Indians? And so he's trying to figure out historically what happened to the indigenous Calusa that were here. Are they Seminoles? And so these are some of the questions that he's trying to answer. So despite their official inclusion among the Seminoles who were removed from Florida during the Second Seminole War, the Spanish Indians were in fact the mixed blood offspring of Spanish fishermen and early Creek and Yamasee immigrants to southwest Florida coast, many of whom were baptized in Cuba and whose lifestyles by the 1830s were apparently as much or more Spanish than Indian. Dr. Worth makes the case that these Spanish Indians and the Cuban fishing ranchos they lived in represent an important and largely unstudied case of creolization during the colonial period. He goes on to say that although the abrupt and tragic ending of these Creole communities during the 1830s makes it impossible to say how this process might have evolved over time, a review of their origins provides some important insights into the process of creolization in general, and especially as it evolved in the context of maritime connection between Cuba and South Florida. So he's looked over, Dr. Worth has looked over and conducted detailed review of non-white baptismal records from the Church of Nuestra Señora de Regla in Regla, Cuba, that revealing that between 1805 and 1821, a total of 30 baptisms were performed on Florida Indians, including 20 born to Spanish husbands and Indian wives, 5 born to Indian women with unnamed fathers, and 3 born to 2 Indian parents. The Spaniards were all native to a number of cities in Spain, Mexico, Cuba, and other locations, and the Indians were native to a range of named towns, including several known or thought to have been Cuban fishing ranchos, including Yusepa Island, Punta Rasa, Sanibel, and Tampa. So this raw data that Dr. Worth has mined from sources in Spain and Cuba, this small selection of baptisms performed in Cuba show a sample of the multi-ethnic children and families living in the ranchos in Florida, in southwest Florida. Another contemporary source quoted by Worth that he found implies that the women at the fisheries were all of the Indian race, with the color of the children's skin betraying the mixed blood of the Spaniard and the Indian. So, Worth continues to cite numerous accounts that further confirm that their culture was more Hispanic than Indian, and of course more maritime than terrestrial. As noted in a letter arguing against their removal with the Seminoles, Judge Augustus Steele asserted that they are entirely identified by habit, occupation, and intermarriage with people of another nation, of different pursuits and modes of life, and incapable of supporting themselves by ordinary Indian means. By driving them from the sea, you would take them from their own and place them in absolute want without aid from some unprovided source. So based on Dr. Worth's findings and documentary evidence, it becomes kind of clear that the Spanish Indians of southwest Florida were indeed a Creole population, really clear, linked to the Cuban fishing industry, and which represented Spanish and Creek identities, uniquely adapted to the coastal estuaries of Florida's lower peninsular Gulf Coast, neither fully Spanish nor fully Indian. This photo here is actually part of the later period, but it really is a kind of a good example of who these people were. This is a photograph that's taken from a book put together by a gentleman named Robert Edict, and he was part of a oral history study that went on in Charlotte Harbor. The book that came out of it was called Fisher Folk of Charlotte Harbor. And he was actually contracted, so to speak, by the Division of Historical Resources, the Florida DHR, to really record this information and to put it together and author a book. And out of that book is just some great information about the early part of the fishing industry in Florida, and he even goes back to talk about Calusa fishing methods, and then talks about these early settlers, these Cuban fishing ranchos, and uses this family as an example. This is the Padilla family. This is Tariva Padilla, and they're actually, he's a native of Canary Islands, and they founded a fishery or a fishing rancho on Cayo Costa in the 1870s. This photograph was taken about 1901. Somewhere, I think it's on, I forget, it might have been Cayo Costa, and the guy standing in the back is the Anglo owner of the island who allowed these fishermen to live there. And interesting, what's really cool about this picture is all these little people that you see here. This woman named Esperanza and a couple of the other little ones were still alive and were actually interviewed by Mr. Edick and some other folks. And so he's got some great information. And some other information from some of the old-timers, the other old-timers that were still around, that were still fishing, you know, had some great stories about Tariva. So if you ever see it, it's a wonderful book to pick up called Fisher Folk of Charlotte Harbor. But he was boss man, and he was an enterprising fella, not only in the fish trade, but the aguardiente trade, that firewater stuff that they were probably making on both sides of the Caribbean. So anyways, really kind of a neat story, and just shows a good example of who these Hispanics, these Spanish fishermen were, although later than the time period that I'm talking about here. So what about these ranchos? What did they actually look like? And can archaeology help us put forth a better picture? Some sources give us an idea. William Whitehead, who was a customs agent back in the 1830s, describes rancho dwellings as being about 15 to 20 square feet, with walls and ceilings framed in wood, covered in thatch, equipped with few cooking utensils, 2 or 3 stools and a table. Whitehead also observed the figure of an angel, the only semblance of a religious observance he noted. Visiting Army officers called Bunce's Rancho near Tampa Bay the most elaborate equipped rancho along the entire coast, with 30 to 40 comfortably thatched houses. Bunce's house had paneled and grooved floors. Unfortunately, only a few archaeological investigations have proceeded on these sites and to determine really the spatial layout of some of these rancho sites. Mostly the material has been recovered during surface surveys or during other archaeological excavations that are really looking at the prehistoric occupations there, and the thin layer that are these Cuban fishing ranchos is recorded, but not really determined or hasn't been part of an overall archaeological survey. So we're still waiting on that, right, Meg? So Worth notes that testing at several of these coastal rancho sites has yet to produce any evidence for contemporary Native American style pottery in use by Creeks and Seminoles during this period, but instead are completely dominated by a Spanish colonial assemblage. He concludes that it seems highly likely, given the documentary evidence alone, that the material culture of the Spanish Indians may be largely indistinguishable from a typical Cuban assemblage, though detailed studies should be undertaken to determine any distinguishing characteristics, however subtle. And that is really kind of the gist of what Meg is going to try to do with her thesis research. So I wanted to point out in the next couple of slides, this assemblage is part of a ceramic assemblage that was picked up, well, not just ceramics, but artifact assemblage that was picked up from a site down in Charlotte Harbor down here, Fisherman's Key, which is located on the south side of where the Caloosahatchee River comes out. If anybody's familiar with the bridge that goes over to Sanibel, there's a small island right there to the north. Anyways, this was part of a surface survey, a surface collection that was done by a researcher named Dr. Annette Snap, who's actually hails from the University of South Florida. But there's a ballast pile in the water just on the north side of the key, and there's also all this evidence along the shoreline and in the interior of the key on the surface that are Spanish colonial assemblages, pearlware, olive jar, this stuff called rayware, which was pretty prevalent down there. Of course, demijohns are large, free-blown and hand-blown glass. Here's an example of an olive jar and some more olive jars. So lots and lots of Spanish material. And this is one of the sites. Fisherman's Key is one of the sites, one of the rancho sites that have been looked at. Another one is at the mouth of the Manatee River, and it's where DeSoto National Memorial is today. And this is supposedly where Bunce landed and set up his first rancho in 1834. He was only there for a couple of years, but historical documents talk about a rancho already being there. And this photograph is of Toll Fogarty, who was also a fisherman, came from Fogartyville, which was in the interior a little bit away from the coastline of present-day Bradenton. And he's standing at the doorway of a tabby ruins, or a tabby house, which are now in ruins at DeSoto National Memorial, and part of a National Register nomination that was put forth by the National Park Service, where they did some archaeological survey out at the park. Here's the tabby ruins, and these are all shovel test locations that they did around. One thing that they did note through the recovery of this archaeological investigations out there at DeSoto National Memorial is that the material that was recovered points to an earlier time period, even really earlier than when Bunce was there in 1834, so 1820s, something like that. And they still want to go back and try to figure it out. They just don't have a lot of evidence to support that other than kind of a mean ceramic date or what they think, somebody was there. So even though these tabby ruins have sometimes been associated with a later homestead in the 1850s, archaeological evidence at DeSoto National Memorial points to an earlier time period. So we could have some good evidence of a Spanish Cuban fishing rancho there. Another site that has been part of a archaeological survey is these human remains that were identified as Spanish Indian down in Sarasota County. And this is close to where Philip E. Bermudez had his rancho, or his rancho was located, in the neighborhood of Cherokee Park. And if you come out on Saturday, the woman that actually did this research for her senior thesis will be here talking about these human remains and how she actually identified them as a Spanish Indian. So another site located in the Tampa Bay area that's been looked at archaeologically and may even have more evidence. And probably the most investigated or the most looked into site was the site of Jose Caldiz on Yusepa Island. This was done a few years ago, about 15 years ago probably, by University of Florida. Bill Marquardt and Marie Palov wrote up the report. And what they were able to see and what they were able to determine is, of course, another Spanish colonial assemblage, artifact assemblage, but they really had more area to survey and really recovered some pretty good information from this site. So out of all the Rancho sites that have been investigated archaeologically or recorded, this is probably the most well-known and most well-known of, I guess would be the way to say it. Most well-investigated. Is that the right way to put it out there? So anyways, just a few have been looked at archaeologically over the years. So ultimately, it was, which Meg touched on, this ambiguous cultural identity that would prove to be the downfall of the Spanish Indians, pitting them against the antagonists on both sides of the Seminole War. It was a band of Seminoles under Chief Waihoki that destroyed the Yusepa Rancho in 1836, provoking the remaining 100 Spanish Indians, of which Perico Pompom was probably a part, to flee north to Tampa Bay. And the following year was the U.S. military which forcibly removed the wives and children to the Indian territories, though not before at least some Spanish Indians moved inland to join the Seminole rebels in an effort to resist the removal. It was apparently in this context that the Spanish Indian Antonio, who had been a crew member of the U.S. sailing vessel, took on the identity of Chacaica and went to war against the United States. His death and the defeat of the capture of his rebel band marked the final chapter of this remarkable Creole community along the southwest Florida coast, and one that has yet to really receive the scholarly attention that it deserves. That's pretty much the end, but what we see is this continued trade with Cuba. You know, it doesn't stop, even though the Rancho period is really given a time period from about 1780 to 1840, or this time period in the Second Seminole War. We see their descendants and the Cuban trade never really stop. More people just got involved, and it really opened it up to other American entrepreneurs to come down and establish themselves in this this Cuban fishing industry, this Cuban fishing trade, and other Spaniards to come and settle in the Tampa Bay and the west coast of Florida. So with that, we've got a couple of events. On Saturday, we're going to be out here doing our mess about. We got a lot of boats, hopefully a lot of kayaks, a couple of sailboats on display, and some presentations to talk a little bit more about one site in particular, the human remains found down in Sarasota, and then also some of the other kind of expanding it into this whole colonial context and the influences that were a part of the 1700s and the 1800s in Florida, or the Second Spanish Empire, or excuse me, Second Spanish period in Florida. And then we're doing it again, another mess about down in Sarasota on June 19th. So thanks for your time tonight, and hopefully everybody can come out. Any questions? Yeah, Bernard Romans, in his account in 1776, he talks about what the fishermen would do when they would come and when they would reestablish themselves along the coast. And they would bring all their own net material, and they'd really fix up their nets. And he did mention something about not long line, but he did call it, you know, just a string or a line. So they must have been doing some kind of line fishing or hand line fishing. I don't know if, from the historical documents that I've looked at, it doesn't really seem that the Spanish fishermen were involved in a fresh fish trade. That seems to be a later period when some American sailors or American fishermen got involved in it. That's when the smacks really came down and around the peninsula, and they were trading this fresh fish. It's hard to say. Salt was such a big deal to the Spaniards. You know, it was an integral part of the whole industry, the whole trade. The Spanish government would use these fishing boats to procure salt for the Spanish government, and then the fishermen would have to purchase it back from Spain. They weren't allowed to process it themselves, and there was a real high tariff on it, so they had a tight control over salt. And I don't know when the fresh fish, I think probably later in that time period, they really started marketing that fresh fish. I know a lot of Anglos, that was really part of the American market, was the fresh fish trade. So it's an interesting question. That's probably true, that the Spanish fishermen learned a lot of learned methods that worked in this environment.
Yeah,
because they were coming from Cuba, which is, I don't know for certain, but I think it's a different fishing environment. There's not the coastal estuaries and whatnot. So they probably learned through watching and through years of just seeing and being taught. But what Dr. Worth argues is that the Spanish Indians are not Calusa at all. That the Calusa were driven off, and then when this intermarriage began and they became Spanish Indians, or this new Creole community of Spanish Indians, that they were part of a different community of Indians. They were part of the Creeks and Yamasees that came down. Yeah, he's saying that by 1704 and 1711, the indigenous Calusa were pretty much out of Florida and even out of the Keys by that time. So, yeah. Yeah, so it became this, and that's what Meg's going to spend the next 2 years of her life on, is figuring it's figuring out, you know, was this a true Creole population? I mean, what's the definition there? But, you know, and who were they? And I think, you know, kind of going off of other research that's out there, she'll have some good ideas. And comparing these few assemblages, artifact assemblages, and looking at them, see if there is any indication of this identity, this Spanish Indian identity, or is it just really more Spanish, even though they weren't fully Spanish. Thanks, guys.